Hello, you're very welcome to this third in a series of 3 webinars on considering therapeutic writing approaches to working with people experiencing food and body image struggles, including clinical diagnoses like eating disorders and body dysmorphic disorder. We've had a lovely journey together in the first 2 sessions so far. So just to go over some of the foundation stones that we shared in those first 2 sessions, we spoke a little bit about narrative therapy and associated therapeutic writing and how this is based on the work of social workers Michael White and David Epstein, really the fathers of narrative therapy. And one of the core premises of narrative therapy is that people make sense of their lives through stories, particularly the stories they tell themselves about themselves. And within narrative therapy, mental health difficulties, including eating disorders and BDD, would be viewed not as intrinsic and essential attributes of people or relationships, but rather as part of a wider mental health pathologizing discourse or narrative, which maintains rather than resolves the difficulties that the person is experiencing. So one of these core phrases that often come up within narrative therapy is this sense of the person is not the problem is the problem. Therefore, part of our role as therapists is to support people to thicken the narrative, to thicken the story that they have about themselves and the stories that they've assimilated from what other people say about them. And one way we can do this is through therapeutic writing approaches. And just to mention as well, of course, that language is really important here, isn't it? So we are born into a certain way of languaging our experiences, and this language, therefore, is socially constructed. So the way we story ourselves, the way we talk about ourselves is very much socially constructed and situated within our cultural, social and familial contexts. Important to hold in mind. Okay, so before we move on to thinking about poetry and metaphor, the focus of this particular webinar, I thought it would be really important actually, and remiss not to, mention Joseph Campbell, mythologist Joseph Campbell, and particularly the hero's journey. So Joseph Campbell, mythologist, did amazing work in looking at myths and stories and fairy tales and legends across cultures and across times, and found this pattern emerging, the hero's journey, the journey that the protagonist and often many other characters within the story go on. So there's some core stages within this journey. The first stage is this call to adventure. So there's a call to the unknown, there's a call out of the normal life, if you like, as the person has been experiencing it. And if we think about that in terms of the people we're working with that are struggling with, for example, eating disorders and BDD, that call to adventure and into the unknown might actually appear to be somehow tangled up with that mental health experience. So that call to adventure, that call out of the familiar, is a call actually into a very dark place. And then there's a cycle that Helena might actually put up on the screen as part of this webinar. There's a cycle that you then kind of move down, if you like, in this journey into the abyss, into this very dark place. Joseph Campbell is very famous for saying, at the darkest moment comes the light. So in this abyss, there's a certain death that happens, and it could be the physical death of the character. And indeed, in religious traditions across time and cultures, it often is a physical death. So we have the physical death of religious leaders and visionaries like Jesus Christ and Guru Nanak. And then there's a rebirth that happens. So either a physical rebirth, so the resurrection of Jesus Christ, or the emerging from the water of Guru Nanak, having gone down into the water for 3 days and appearing to be dead. Or it's a death and a rebirth of an emotional nature. Something dies, something breaks away, and from that something emerges. It's that phoenix arising from the ashes. And then we begin the ascent back up the other side of that circle, where some sort of a transformation happens. So within that death and that rebirth, the transformative process leads that person to return back to their normal life, if you like. But instead of returning back to where they were with the things they had at that time, they're now returning with this transformation having taken place, and tools in their toolbox then to support the journey going forward. So they're kind of going back perhaps to their families or to their loved ones in a different state to the state that they left. And again, thinking about this in terms of the mental health journey, we've got that descent into the abyss and the darkness. We have a sense of transformation, and then a sense of somehow finding a way to assimilate that transformation into one's daily life. And actually, Campbell describes 17 main stages of the journey, which you might be interested to look up. And of course, not all journeys and stories necessarily contain all 17 stages explicitly. However, they're organised into 3 divisions, or if we think about it like a play or a theatre, 3 acts. And I've described those in a sense to you just now. So we have the departure or the separation. We have that initiation, which is that descent and that transformation, and then we have that return. Okay, so we'll continue to hold that in mind as we go through. And I think it will really help us to think about the experience so many of our clients go on. And just to say that this isn't a cycle that happens once and then we're done. Of course not. Often then there's a sequel, isn't there, in the stories and the myths and legends, so that the hero goes out then with the new resources they have on another journey. And so often clients will say to us, I feel I've gone completely back to square one. I was doing so well. Or families will come to us and say, I'm really scared. They seem to be back in that dark place that they were in, and we're having to start all over again. And that's when it can be really helpful to get out the cycle of the hero's journey and to talk and think about it and consider that these aren't necessarily relapses. They're another cycle. And yet it's not square one, because that person now has additional resources to move through that cycle. So today we'll be particularly thinking about metaphors and my very favourite topic, poetry. And of course, if we were doing this in a live space together, we'd be going into breakout rooms and exploring some poetry together, and also perhaps even having a go at creating some poetry in groups. And that's something you might like to go off and explore. But let's begin our journey with thinking about metaphors. And indeed, mental health experiences themselves, BDD and eating disorders notwithstanding, are themselves or can themselves be viewed as a metaphor. So, the practices we seek out to amend our bodies are arguably metaphors. For example, metaphors for our early caregiving relationships, given that the sense of our bodies emerge within the context of these early relationships. So, of course, it is through the primary caregiver that the infant organises its early bodily sensations and experiences, thus coming to a sense of a body self, a somatic felt sense of self. Alessandra Lemmer and others would argue that when there are difficulties in that early relationship, particularly in the touch and the gaze with the primary caregiver, it can feel impossible to feel at home in one's body, or even to have a sense that one has or is a body. In adolescence then, when the body, perhaps more than any other life stage, very strongly presents itself to the psyche, there can be a real tension there. And possibly one reason, therefore, why, of course not exclusively, but BDD and eating disorders very often emerge around that time. And there's a sense for the person that the body is somehow to be at fault or to be blamed for the way they're feeling about themselves. And there's a sense of a fragmented self. So there's a thinking self over here, and then there's a body over here. And my thinking self can exert control in some sense over the appearance of the body. And that control over the appearance of the body offers a semblance of hope. And that hope is, if I fix the body, if I lose the weight, if I clear up the skin, if I have the cosmetic surgery on my nose and have it reshaped, or whatever appearance project it is, then I will feel lovable, safe and whole. I will be lovable is the core thing. I will be good enough and I will be lovable. And shame, of course, is a really, really big part of this. So in some ways, we could also see that projection onto the physical body as a metaphor for the shame the person is experiencing, with shame being completely different from guilt, of course. So guilt being the sense of I have done something bad, but shame being the sense of I am bad. I'm bad at my core. And this felt sense of badness then being projected onto the physical appearance, with the desperate hope that when the physical appearance is fixed, the sense of shame, the sense of one's felt sense of badness will leave. So that shame as well, forming part of that metaphor. The BDD, the anorexia, the bulimia, in some way being a metaphor for the felt sense of shame. So we want to hold these ideas in mind, I suggest, as we move through and we think about therapeutic poetry, reading and writing, because one of the primary ways we're working with poetry is of course through metaphor. And as somebody with lived experience personally of anorexia and BDD, I can absolutely say with my hands on my heart that poetry has been a massive part of my journey of healing, a massive part of my hero's journey, in as much as reading it has helped me to resonate and make sense of some of my experiences. It's given me some of those aha moments where things that have been just beneath the level of conscious awareness have become conscious. And then through a lot of the writing of poetry, which has supported me in a huge way to make sense of my experiences, to assimilate them, and therefore to have the space and the capacity to move beyond some of the stuckness that certainly I experienced for many years, that cycling around the hero's journey, but can keep going back into the darkness and not quite finding my way back up. Poetry for me was one way of navigating my way back to that return.